Welcome to Breaking Legs and Breaking Hearts with Gary Tonin. This is going to be the first time I cover a DVD topic that a range of other athletes have covered, including John Danaher, as well as other teammates of mine, like Craig Jones, have come out with leg locking material. I've leg locked a number of high-level athletes over the years of my career. Specifically, as I progressed, I even submitted some of the most premier names in the leg locking world in the sport. Notable people like Marcin Held, Masaku Imanari. I didn't leg lock Rousimar Palhares, but I went toe-to-toe with him in a battle that was deemed a draw. But I had many really good exchanges with him where I put him in a lot of danger. And I've leg locked many other opponents who were not specifically leg lock masters. But this DVD is absolutely going to include some material that you've seen before from the squad, that you've seen before in other leg locking information. But you're going to get a little bit of my look and my perspective at how all of this works, how I approach the leg locking game, what my strategies are, as well as some of the stuff that the team's been working on towards the end, some of the newer things that we've been working on. So this is going to be a really valuable tool in your arsenal, a new addition to your material that you already have from the perspective of an athlete who has submitted many people with various leg locks, whether it be knee bars, inverted heel hooks, outside heel hooks. I've done a broad variety of different submissions on high-level opponents. So I think that this next DVD is going to add a lot to your game. Okay, so as I stated in the beginning of the DVD, one of the things that I wanted to do was make this the lessons that I teach in this DVD able to be used by both beginner, intermediate, and advanced level students. I want you to be able to pick this up, and I want somebody who's never done leg locks before to be able to use it, and I want somebody that's been doing leg locks for the past 5 years to be able to use it to make their game better. I think it'll be advantageous to all of you, but the only way I can do that is if I go through different stages of the process. And I think you'll find that even if you're at an advanced stage in a leg locking game, there'll be something to be gained even from the introduction to some of these different positions that we're going to use. One of the most important things to talk about when we're talking about leg locks is the various entanglements that we use, okay? So this is going to be a brief introduction to some of those entanglements, the pros and cons of them, what they're used for, what submissions are available, etc. So what we're going to start with is a position we refer to as a Rimi Ashigarami, or a beginning Ashigarami, standard Ashigarami. There's quite a few different names for it, okay? And what tends to happen is I have my training partner's leg crossing the line of my hip like so, my heel coming over my training partner's hip like so, and then a far foot. Now, depending upon who you're learning from, this far foot could be placed in a couple different locations, but the optimal location in a Rimi Ashigarami would be your training partner's far thigh, and we'll discuss that at a later date as to why that's going to be the case. Then my knee would cover my own heel like so, and this would be in our Rimi Ashigarami situation. And part of the reason we refer to this as a beginning Ashigarami is because it often lends itself to other forms of Ashigarami. Okay, we use that Rimi Ashigarami to move and manipulate my training partner's body to move elsewhere. For example, one of our main basic movements is to roll my opponent through in an outside heel hook, follow the opponent, and then end up in an outside Ashigarami situation where my two legs are locked. And we'll discuss that drill at a later date. Okay, so that's mainly what this movement is used for. And in that last discussion that I just said, one of our main drills being to rotate my training partner, one of the main advantages to this position is my ability to turn my opponent and look at this, expose my training partner's heel. All right, speaking about heel exposure, all that really means is that my training partner's heel is in a position in which my wrist can come underneath it, okay? When my training partner's knee is turned out and the heel is tucked in, there's no heel exposure. It's very difficult to get a hold of my training partner's heel. So this is great for that. It's great for exposing submissions. It's great for transferring to other forms of Ashigarami. It's also great for stopping my training partner from moving towards me, right, on some level, because I have some obstacles in my opponent's way. There's no degree of back exposure here. My training partner goes to try to take my back. It's not really possible. All right, like I said, there's impediments in the way. Okay, so it makes it so that my training partner has a tough time doing too much to me. Well, I can set up the majority of my attacks. Okay, now let's talk about another situation. Outside Ashigarami. okay? Where my legs lock over the outside of my opponent's hip, okay? Let's talk about some of the basics of this situation and why we use this, okay? The Orimi Ashigarami situation, like we had mentioned, is mainly used for setting things up. We rarely actually finish the opponent from here, okay? While it is possible, and you'll see it in competition, somebody locking up a heel hook from an Orimi Ashigarami and breaking somebody, it's difficult to accomplish because it's so easy to collapse the Ashigarami. All my training partner has to do is take a foot off, and all of a sudden I don't have breaking leverage anymore, okay? When I close my legs over my training partner's hip, all of that becomes more difficult. So it naturally makes breaking my training partner much easier when I cover my training partner's hip like so. So we use this position to break. However, there are vulnerabilities to using this outside Ashigarami situation, which are my training partner's ability to sit up and crush me, okay, and collapse, and my training partner's abilities to expose my back, okay? So that becomes a problem. There's no obstacles between me and my opponent, okay? So one of the things that we have to be conscious of when we switch to this position is we would like to already have a submission locked up before we get here. If I have an outside heel hook and my legs are an outside Ashigarami and he goes to try to take my back, it's a difficult thing. He has to get his heel free first, then the back exposure and all those sorts of things come, and then he can crush me. But in the time being, he tries to press forward. The submission itself is what stops my training partner from pushing into me, okay? So keep that in mind. We use this as a finishing position. We don't really like this position solely for the purpose of controlling my opponent without a submission. This is great, Orimi Ashigarami, for that. Now, moving forward, just to make a really smooth transition, if you wanted to do this as a drill to familiarize yourself with all the forms of Ashigarami, we can move right to 50-50 from here. Anytime you want to change positions in Ashigarami, okay, and you want to change Ashigaramis, one of the easiest ways to do it is to either move your feet to one side or the other, or move your opponent's feet to one side or the other. That will immediately change whatever Ashigarami you have. So if we're an outside Ashigarami, we move his foot across, we're in a 50-50 situation. Now I'm just going to change orientations for a second so you can see what's going on the other side here. Okay? In this 50-50 situation, okay, another form of leg entanglement. Again, just talking about the basics of this situation, why we would want to be here, why we wouldn't. Okay? I get a lot of access to my training partner's inside heel here. Okay? So we get inside heel exposure for inverted heel hooks. Okay? It's a much more powerful break, so that's nice. Disadvantages, okay, my training partner locks his ankles. He has 2 feet to fend off attacks with. Okay, my training partner can always kind of push and cause problems with that top side foot, all right, even locking his legs, making it difficult to access, okay? Even if I do manage to access the foot, my training partner can often reach up and grab and pull and hold me, making it hard to finish various submissions from here, okay? I can also, if my training partner's legs are locked, I do have some submission opportunities on my training partner's opposite leg. There's some toe holds and things like that I can go for from here, okay? The major downsides to this Ashigarami as well is it's much easier for my opponent to attack me. The other Ashigaramis that we've described thus far, it's rare for your opponent to attack you in those Ashigaramis, okay? In an Orimi Ashigarami, there's not too many ways he can attack me. In an outside Ashigarami, there's not too many ways he can attack me. The moment we go to 50-50, my training partner always has an ability to separate my legs and go for any of the submissions that I would have went for on him. So this is something to be conscious of when selecting which Ashigarami to use. Okay, again, understanding that a big part of what we're doing here is developing an arsenal of different weapons that we have, all right, as well as mechanisms to use those weapons, which are the Ashigaramis, right? Okay, and I need to be able to know when the weapons are available. For example, I know that there's an inverted heel hook here. All right, and I need to know what's going to be my vehicle, okay, to get to those weapons, which in this case happens to be 50-50. All right, once we move out of this position, okay, we'll be talking about the next basic Ashigarami transition will be to throw our feet to the inside of the opponent. So I had mentioned before, if you want to switch Ashigaramis, it's a very simple thing to do. You either move your opponent's foot or you move your feet from one side of the hip to the other. Now we're in what we refer to as a cross Ashigarami, and there's many variations of this. Okay, there's variations where my feet come together. There's variations where there's a full lock, and we'll talk about some of those in the future. Okay, but for the time being, the main things we want to learn about this position is that we have inverted heel hooks available, and then our feet are now hidden from attacks. Okay, so if my training partner were to try to attack my feet now, it's a process to get there, unlike 50-50. So we tend to prefer this situation over 50-50. Why? Because the feet are not as available. I get attacks on the opponent while he doesn't get attacks on me. Okay, and that's the main use of this position. Downsides, just like 50-50, my opponent has a interference leg that causes some problems. Now, while he can still use this leg to interfere in this situation, it's of certain detriment to him. When he uses this leg to interfere, he then surrenders it to me for the purposes of control. So I will also suggest to you that cross ashigarami situations are great for simply controlling your opponent's movements and getting a hold of two legs. He can roll all across the mat here, and I can follow my opponent quite easily with no issues. All right, whereas when I just hold on to one leg in any of these other forms of ashigarami, when my training partner tries to move around and pull away, it tends to be a little bit easier. So that's the other benefit of being in this position, is a very easy capture of my training partner's second leg. So we spend a lot of time in this position going back and forth between capturing my training partner's second leg and switching off to the inverted heel hook on this side, okay? This situation is also very good for spinning your opponent's legs, okay? For example, getting into knee bar situations, okay? Coming up, spinning around my opponent's leg and moving into various attacks like so. So as a basic drill, when I teach seminars, before I even really get started, just to familiarize yourself with positions, I just have students go back and forth between these different ashigaramis. They start out a rimi. So they pull the leg in, they put a heel on the hip, they put a knee attack and just extend that leg so they can see. Okay? Then they go to outside and they lock their legs outside. Then they lean back, they pull the leg across for a strong 50-50 entry. Okay? My training partner can lock his feet if he wants to, it doesn't make a difference. Maybe we separate, practice the idea of getting to the heel. Now we move to another ashigarami by moving our feet, the cross ashigarami. And we move through the entire birth of different ashigaramis, all right, all in one sequence. So we just get used to starting to use them. So we learn how to control our training partner before we go to break them. And we'll get more into detail with that again. We'll do it on the other side just so you can see. A rimi, okay, and outside, moving my opponent's foot, 50-50 situation, and then eventually moving my feet to the cross ashigarami situation. You can even play around with the idea of getting double trouble and collecting two legs here. Okay? We'll get much more in depth about the advantages, disadvantages, problems, and benefits of being in each of these situations further along in the DVD, but I think it's a good start to just touch on the basics. So I thought it would be useful for us to enter into a discussion before we start talking about each of these submissions themselves and the basic breaking mechanics surrounding them, to discuss some very important aspects of our sport when it comes to submissions. And this is going to be applying to pretty much any submission that we have in the sport. All right, it's principles of lever, wedges, and fulcrum. Okay, and then I would even venture to say that there'd be a fourth thing that you would have to worry about would be direction of force. Okay, but we'll start with lever, wedges, and fulcrum. We'll see where we get. So when it comes to the legs, there's going to be rotational submissions, and then there's going to be more straightforward submissions, linear submissions. Okay, but regardless, there's always going to be levers, wedges, and fulcrums. Okay, it's a little bit more obvious with the linear submissions. Instead of using a leg lock example, I'm just going to use an arm lock as an example so that it's a little bit easier to identify, okay? Because many people are much more familiar with upper body submissions. So we'll start at the arms, and then you'll see how this applies at the legs as I start discussing principles of lever, wedges, and fulcrum as we get into the basic breakdowns of each of the mechanics. So my training partner is going to lay down on the mat. He's going to surrender one of his arms. All right, for a Jujigatame. Okay, so let's talk about what's the bare essentials for establishing this submission hold, okay? If I'm going to apply breaking leverage on an arm, I need a few different things, okay? And I got to identify what those things are, okay? First of all, to break any part of my training partner's body, I have to control my training partner's body. This is particularly important with rotational submissions. Linear submissions is important too. Let's say, for example, I don't have my legs involved in a Jujigatame. So let's say my 2 feet are on this side of the body, and I were to start extending an arm over my hip, okay? So there's nothing to hold my training partner's body down, okay? If his body couldn't move from here, I could absolutely break his arm over my hip, all right? But anybody who's a alert, alive person, as I go to pull on their arm like this, is going to follow the braking pressure so that they can take that braking pressure off, okay? If somehow he was glued to the floor, okay, as I go to pull on my training partner's arm, I would absolutely break it from here, okay, because he couldn't move. So what holds him against the floor is my legs. And what we refer to as anything that impedes my training partner's motion and holds him in place, we refer to as a wedge. Okay, there's different ways to wedge your training partner. There's a ton of different ways to do it in different situations. For the time being, I'll put one wedge in at my training partner's midsection, one wedge in at my training partner's head and neck. Okay, and now that my training partner's held, all right, in two ways. My training partner's held close to me, and he's also held against the floor. Because if I don't hold my training partner close to me, he can pull out and away in this direction. No, literally just scoot yourself away, and his elbow can come to the mat. So let's look at that again. Okay, so if I don't pull inwards, my training partner can scoot out this way and drop his elbow to the mat, right? So I need a wedge that both holds my training partner close to me and also pins him down. Now, if I just pulled him close to me and I didn't pin him down, he could sit up and I'd lose the leverage that way. Don't even worry about clearing. Just sit up. And now I can't break my training partner. So I hold him close to me and I pin him down. And now, as I start to apply pressure, I can break someone. So wedge is the first thing we got to identify. Anything that's going to stop my training partner from moving, that's your wedge. Okay? And in this case, that's my legs. Okay? It's going to be the case in your leg lock submissions as well. Okay? Another thing that I'm going to look to do is find a fulcrum to place on my training partner's body. Okay? In this case, my hip. The hip is a pretty good fulcrum. What makes for a good fulcrum? Something that's elevated and something that's hard. Okay? If I go to try to break my training partner over a soft part of my body, for example, like maybe my thigh, okay? If you were to try to break someone over your stomach or something like that, I don't know why you would try to do that, okay? It's a soft part of your body. It's probably not going to do so well, okay? You need that fulcrum to be able to stay put while you break something over it, okay? So my hip bone, for example, all right, makes for a very good fulcrum, okay? It's hard and it's elevated, okay? And I can even elevate it further by lifting my hips up off the ground, okay? So when we talk about the fulcrum that's in place in a lever, the higher the fulcrum is, the more effective, okay? The more leverage there's going to be. In a basic lever, the fulcrum typically doesn't move. In jiu-jitsu, the fulcrum moves all the time, okay? In fact, it's a great benefit to you to move the fulcrum. If I don't pull my training partner's arm any further and I leave my hands here and I just elevate the fulcrum, I can often get a tap, okay? So that goes to show you that the elevation of the fulcrum plays a role, all right, in how easy it is to submit my training partner, okay? Now, finally, the lever arm itself, okay? This is the final part of the lever. It's very, very important. If I go to attack a lever arm that is short, okay, so for example, fulcrum's here, and I attack only a little bit above said fulcrum, but with a little bit of resistance, okay, so just flex your arm, Chris, I can't break my training partner. It would be like an arm wrestling match here, okay? The funny thing is, it looks stupid to me, all right, but I've seen people do it. They link in elbow to elbow and lock your hands or something, and they pull. This is fine for control purposes, but if you're actually trying to break somebody from here, lock your hands, Chris. Don't even lock your hands. Just flex your wrist towards your bicep, right? I can't break somebody like this. It's not going to happen, okay? I must walk my hands down to the end of the lever. Now, when my training partner flexes, it takes very little effort. Good. Just maintain force over time. It takes very little effort to beat my training partner's own musculature here, okay? And I can start applying the brake. So I want my hands as far down the lever as possible. So we have a wedge to hold our training partner in place, sometimes multiple wedges, okay? We have a fulcrum, something that's hard and preferably elevated, that we can break something over, okay? And then finally a lever arm, which you want as long as humanly possible, okay, without falling off. You know, for example, I'm not going to grab the tips of my training partner's fingers, okay? I'm going to grab the end of my training partner's hand. And then from here, I push down on the lever arm as the fulcrum gets elevated, and I hold my training partner in place, and we get a strong break, okay? Now, I mentioned one other element, which is direction of force, okay? Why is direction of force so important? Okay, you stay right there. Direction of force is important because when we are breaking limbs, okay, so whether it's I'm breaking someone's bones or whether I'm tearing ligaments, okay, tearing ligaments is a really good way to think about this, okay? I'm typically looking for some sort of shearing force, okay? Meaning that I have two forces in opposite directions meant to tear things, okay? I grab a piece of paper and I tear it with two fingers. It's very hard, all right, if I don't rip in two directions to tear a piece of paper. To just pull it apart, okay, or to rip it with one hand is a difficult thing. You need to rip it like so. You push in two different directions. Sometimes in rotational submissions, that means I rotate one way while rotating another. In the case of heel hooks, for example. In linear submissions, it typically means pressure is going up while pressure is going down, or depends if we're lateral, maybe east to west, whatever the case may be. Okay? So there's two directions of force here. The one direction of force is on the lever arm, okay, pressing downwards. And then the second direction of force is with the fulcrum heading upwards, okay? And because of that shearing force, we could either get torn ligaments here or a potential break, all right, either in my training partner's forearm bones, humerus, whatever the case may be, more than likely, all right, going to be torn ligaments before you would go and break bones in situations like this. Okay, but now we have a little bit of a better understanding of the basic elements of the sport. The truth is that pretty much every aspect of what we do involves levers, wedges, fulcrums, and direction of force, even if it's not a submission. Okay, but it's particularly important to understand via submission. Typically, when a submission goes awry, it's because of one of those four things being off. All right, that is why the submission is not working in the first place. So just to diagnose your own problems when you guys are working in this sport. Oh man, I tried to finish that arm bar, that leg lock, that heel hook, whatever it is, and it wasn't working. Walk yourself through. Hey, what kind of wedge do I have here? Is it doing a good job holding my training partner in place? Hey, where's my fulcrum placed? Is it placed at the breaking point at my training partner's elbow, for example? Is it elevated? Okay, could I do something to elevate it more? Could I use a different fulcrum, something that's harder to break my training partner's limb over? Okay. Other questions to ask: can I maximize the lever arm? Can I make the lever arm longer in some way? Am I reaching inefficiently for the lever arm? And then finally, is my direction of force accurate? Okay. Do I have two forces headed in the same direction? Do I have one force headed kind of in one direction, kind of in another? Or do I have two opposing forces that are pulling ligaments apart or tearing ligaments apart? Right? All right. And if you can start to do those things more efficiently, all right, you can start to improve every part of your jiu-jitsu, but specifically submission holds. So just as I discussed, we would do a brief introduction to various leg entanglements, of the basic leg entanglements of the sport, which are your vehicle to use your weapons, all right, your submission holds. It's useful for us to discuss how to actually use these submission holds to break the opponent. And we'll start in a basic way. Often I find that trying to give a student all of the details, all of the finishing details in a particular category is detrimental. It isn't as helpful as you think it would be. You have to do it in a progressive way. You start with certain details and then you work your way up to more advanced details. So we're going to start with very basic breaking mechanics, and we're going to talk about the toe hold because I believe it's one of the more familiar leg locks, especially because for years, many people weren't allowed to do heel hooks. They were only allowed to do toe holds, knee bars, and Achilles locks. The toe hold is a close cousin of the outside heel hook, and we'll talk about that when we get into the outside heel hook. We'll just drill this movement from an Arimi Ashigarami or an outside. Both are going to be acceptable in this instant. Again, keeping in mind that when we do this practically, this wouldn't necessarily be the way that I would have you guys going for a toe hold. This is more just to discuss how to break somebody in the position, not so much the way that I would go to get there, okay, or the vehicle that I would use to get to this position, okay? So first things first, I'm going to get some exposure here, and I'm going to turn my training partner's foot. From this position, I'm going to grasp my training partner's foot like so, at the end of the lever to the best of my ability, all right, with my hand, okay? My secondary hand is going to reach underneath my training partner's shin bones like so, okay, and lock up on my own wrist, okay? So we have a little bit of a Kimura feel to this type of submission, okay? My arm reaching underneath, my other hand grabbing. Now, you can do this in a number of different ways and get mixed results, okay? Based on the description that I just gave you, I could reach way up here on my training partner's calf muscle and I can grab my own wrist. I could reach way down low. There's a ton of different configurations that I could go for that would follow the words that I just told you, okay? So let's be a little bit more specific. I'm going to take this finger right here, the middle one, and I'm going to line it up with my training partner's pinky toe, okay? So that middle finger is just going to cover my training partner's pinky knuckle, okay? In case you can't see that, right there, okay? And that's going to be a pretty good start as far as the end of the lever. If you go much further than that, you start to lose your training partner's toes, okay? So there's a kind of an end point here of diminishing returns as far as reaching the end of the lever when it comes to grabbing your training partner's foot, okay? As far as the secondary hand is concerned, when I reach this arm through, we kind of want to be as low on my training partner's ankle as possible. Why? Okay, well now we're going to start to get into a discussion about breaking in general. We want to create a situation where the fulcrum, that's what we're about to place in here, the thing that I'm going to break my training partner's ankle over, the fulcrum that's going to rest underneath. Okay, we want that fulcrum to be at the breaking point. Okay, so in theory, if I were to leave the breaking point up here, so if I'm putting the fulcrum here underneath my training partner's shin bones, in theory, I'd be trying to break my training partner's shin in half. Okay, and I don't know if you guys have seen too much competition footage. It's not usually what happens with a toe hold. Usually what we're looking to do is we're looking to do damage to our training partner's ankle, probably at the ligaments more than anything else. Okay, so I want that fulcrum to be down here by my training partner's ankle. When it's up here by the shin, I'm putting a bunch of force into the back of my training partner's calf muscle. It might hurt, okay, but it's not really doing as much damage to the ligaments of the ankle as I could be. So what we're going to start to do is we're going to take this fulcrum, we're going to slide it down, all right, towards the edge of my training partner's ankle, like so. Okay, now, as I break the foot, as I twist my training partner's foot over the fulcrum, that's exactly where the breaking point is, right at my training partner's ankle. All right, and we can start to tear through these ligaments on the outside like so. What you'll start to see is as I turn my training partner's foot, all right, you'll start to see these ligaments start to get very tense, okay, and that's what we'd be tearing through right here. So my elbow comes down, almost matching my training partner's heel, and my hand grasps my training partner's toes like so, okay? Now from this position, I have two directions of force that I want to work with. It's good to push someone's toes down. So I'm just going to show you an example of this. It's just easier to do when I have my training partner facing this direction. Yes, it's good to push somebody's toes down. But that alone, on a game opponent, typically won't do you too much justice. You can, in fact, push someone's toes almost completely to their butt with almost no effect, if you don't also do something with the other arm. In almost every break that we're going to have in this sport, you want two directions of force. So in addition to the push and the folding that I'm going to be doing with this hand, I'm also going to be pulling towards myself with this elbow. So as I push, I pull and lift this elbow off the ground, and we can get good results. Probably better results, and we'll talk about why later, when our legs are wrapped around the outside of our opponent's hip, all right, so we can control our training partner's hip, okay? But as far as the actual breaking mechanics of this toe hold are concerned, okay, with our hand position, we're talking about controlling the end of the lever, okay, via the middle finger, okay, covering my training partner's pinky knuckle, all right, then my elbow matching up and forearm bones matching up underneath my training partner's ankle, where I actually want to break him, a folding of the foot over that fulcrum while lifting and elevating that fulcrum, okay? So the fulcrum that's underneath, I lift it as I press the toes over it to get good results for the break, okay? In a good toe hold, you're probably going to get pressure not just in the ankle, but also in the knee. Now, everything that I've done just thus far is pretty much just focused on my training partner's ankle. If I want to get his knee involved, that means I have to apply force with my ashigarami into my training partner's knee. So the knee is getting twisted in this direction via the ankle, and my hips are going to press the opposite direction so that we can now get pressure on the outside ligaments of my training partner's knee. Okay? And you can do that with a closed wedge or an open wedge, like so. Okay? So it's a pretty good introduction right there to the breaking mechanics of a toe hold, and now we'll move into the outside heel hook. Okay, now I thought it would be useful, another one of our main submissions, the outside heel hook, to talk about some of the basic breaking mechanics that are involved with that. Like I said, I like to start with the toe hold because it's very similar to the outside heel hook. They're very close cousins, and I think it helps people understand because they're a little bit more articulate with the toe hold. If they can compare and contrast that to the outside heel hook, it makes it a little easier for them to start to get it, as opposed to looking at it like a completely new thing. So, keeping the toe hold that we just worked on in mind, we're going to start our outside heel hook action. Again, we can do this from a rimi, ashigarami, or outside, okay? Again, not suggesting that this is usually how I would start to apply this move, but simply suggesting this is how we're going to start to practice mechanics. That's all. Okay, so basic mechanics. We got 3 parts, okay? Just like we had with the toe hold. We have the connection at the end of our training partner's hip with our legs, okay? Whether that be in a rimi situation, crossed legs, there's a ton of different things you can do. Something that controls your training partner's hip. You got a midsection here, the middle of the joint, all right? The joint that's hopefully we're going to be doing the majority of our damage at, my training partner's knee, all right? My hips are going to be what connects to my training partner's knee and controls my training partner's knee in this situation, okay? Probably a bridging of the hips. And then finally, my arms down here at the end of the lever, okay? So what we're going to start to do with our arms is very similar to the toe hold. The toe hold is done with the hands, okay? The heel hook is also done with the hands, but somewhat with the body, okay? What you'll notice with the toe hold is that the foot kind of comes away from my body to a significant degree here. Whereas with the heel hook, everything's almost about joining the foot to my body. So what tends to happen, the main differences between the toe hold and the heel hook are, the toe hold, I don't get to incorporate as much of my spinal extension into the hold as I do with the heel hook. When I get a heel hook, I can literally start extending my spine and breaking my training partner. Whereas with the toe hold, that's much more difficult to do because the foot is out and away from me. It's not an easy thing. We can try to the best of our ability to attach ourselves to the foot and make it so that the body is twisting, but for the majority of the move, it's our hands. Now we get to use our body. So instead of my hand being down here at the end of the lever, okay, a different part of my body is going to cover my training partner's toes. Now, depending upon what you put on your training partner's toes, you can get varying degrees of results. The traditional way to teach this move is to just put your training partner's toes in your armpit and let your armpit do the job that your hand was doing for the toe hold, okay? That's okay. It's adequate. Can you submit somebody here? Yes. You're going to have more success as the toes come into the bicep, okay? As opposed to the armpit like so. There's a few reasons for that. Let's talk about the second element of the move before we get to that, okay? So we mentioned that bicep is probably going to be a little bit better than here in my armpit, okay? Second element of the move, I actually have to hook the heel, okay? Now, this is traditionally taught with an elbow grip like so. And this is how somebody would teach you how to do a heel hook, okay? You put the heel, it fits into the elbow, and geometrically, it looks good, right? You're like, okay, look, this big old heel fits inside the elbow there. This looks nice, okay? And I can see why people would have thought that this was a good idea, okay? But it's not, okay? And here's why, okay? If I go toes to armpit and heel to elbow, first problem, a leverage issue. When we're imparting leverage on something, we want the longest lever possible. When you go armpit and elbow, your lever is like this big. It's not a very big lever. Yes, I know you're twisting at the knee and things like that, but talking about what you're doing to the foot, it's a very small lever, okay? We really want to expand that lever out to this length, okay? And if we're going to do that, we really want to catch inside the bicep here. Once you go full armpit, you see that my bicep, all the pressure kind of goes midfoot, okay, as opposed to the end of the foot here when I catch inside the bicep, okay? Another issue, elevation, okay? Remember how in the toe hold we talked about elevating the fulcrum by lifting this forearm? Well, in the heel hook, the same elevation is going to take place, okay? But it's going to be this wrist that does the elevating. When you lock in armpit and elbow, okay, like so, elevation is incredibly difficult. No matter how high my hands get, the heel, it just stays in the same spot, okay? So I don't get that added pressure. I don't get a lifted fulcrum, and that's what I want, okay? So I catch inside the bicep and I catch inside the wrist. Now I have maximized the leverage. The lever is much longer, okay? And I have an ability to elevate, okay, to lift my training partner's heel. Remember how we talked about pressure in two directions causing a break before and not just one direction? If I just push my training partner's toes, so if I just use the bicep to push the toes, it hurts my opponent's foot. It's often not enough to make them tap. If I just lift my opponent's heel, same thing. If he doesn't move, I might get enough pressure to tap my training partner. But what often happens here is it just results in a roll of the opponent. So what we're looking for is to turn my training partner's foot. Pressure, okay, in with the bicep, okay, while lifting up at the wrist. So now we have a rotation of the foot, okay? So that's a pretty good start, okay? Now, I talked about other elements. A connection at my training partner's hip. There just has to be something there, okay? There's not many rules as far as this is concerned, but there has to be something attached to it. I cannot break somebody with no ashigarami in play, or just like pinched knees or something. There has to be something crossing the line of my opponent's hip. It can even be one leg, even just one foot on the hip here, okay? That's enough to impart leverage on my training partner and break my training partner's leg, okay? But when I leave it open, it opens him up for rolling, and it also opens my training partner up for lifting his hips up off the ground, which takes a certain amount of pressure off of the submission, okay? So that holds my opponent in place, okay? I'm going to activate my legs and hold my opponent in place. My hips are going to lift off the ground and push into my training partner's knee. So we talked about the far end of the break here is controlling my training partner's hip, and the midpoint is pushing into my training partner's knee. And if I get really good, I learn how to rotate my hips and apply pressure to the knee. So that as my training partner's foot gets twisted in this direction, my hips twist the knee in the other direction. And we get what we refer to as a shearing force, okay? Mentioned pressure in two directions. We have a rotation in one direction, meeting a rotation in the other direction, in which case we can tear our training partner's ligaments like a sheet of paper, okay? So our hands are activated. We have pressure on the toes. We have pressure on the heel. Our legs are activated, controlling our training partner's hip. Finally, our hip activates and presses into our training partner's knee. We've had a good solid breaking position here, okay? So once again, a couple different elements. Catching my training partner's toes, catching my training partner's heel. Okay, I'll just lock up like so for now. I lock around my training partner's hip, and my hips press into my opponent's knee for a break like so. And that's a good basic synopsis of some of our breaking mechanics from as far as outside heel hooks are concerned. Okay, so as we continue to discuss some basic breaking mechanics, we'll move on to the inverted heel hook. Now, I will say this about the inverted heel hook. Okay, this is a far more powerful submission. Okay, whether we're in a 50-50 situation, cross ashigarami, doesn't make a difference. Okay, just by the nature of our own biology as human beings, for whatever reason, okay, it's much easier. My training partner's leg is much more pliable as he gets turned in this direction as opposed to getting turned in this direction, all right? And it's so much easier for me to achieve breaking pressure from a position like this, okay? Any form of my legs coming to the inside, all right, or even outside, from this situation where his leg's across my hip, all right, will be considered an inverted heel hook, okay? Now, as far as the actual mechanics are concerned, okay, placement is fairly similar, okay? You can get away with poor mechanics in an inverted heel hook because it's so strong. Even if you go armpit elbow, you do all of these things that I had mentioned before, okay, it's very tight, and I can lean back a little bit and drive my hips in, and I mean, you're going to get people to tap, okay? So you're going to get some false positives sometimes. What do I mean by false positives? Well, I'm referring to a situation where, like, my opponent taps, and I'm like, yeah, I did it. I did a good job. It's like, well, not necessarily. Okay? In the context of training, I'm sure there's been a ton of times where yourself and your training partners have tapped, right, when their leg wasn't going to get catastrophically broken. Maybe it hurt a little bit. Okay? And the problem is when you transfer over into real combat, right, whether it be a fight, whether it be competition, whatever the case may be, and somebody is willing to take a little bit of damage, or they're willing to take a little bit more risk than they are just in a training environment, you're not going to achieve the same level of success. Either you're not going to break the person or they're not going to tap, okay? And so now you're not achieving your desired result. You're achieving the desired result in the training room, and it looks good, it feels good, okay? But then when you go out in competition, it's not working. So even though you're going to get these taps when you're doing things poorly, I would say try to emphasize mechanics as much as you can and practice them, so that when you actually get out into competition and you put these moves on, you're going to be able to more severely break and damage your opponent, or they'd be more likely to tap, okay? So again, we can kind of do this haphazardly, but instead, let's focus on, once again, trying to get toes towards the bicep, all right, and wrist underneath my training partner's heel to the best of my ability. I don't think I mentioned this in the outside heel hook. Another reason to do this is a slippage problem that develops when we go to try to get into these heel hook situations. If I start at the elbow, once he heel slips, there's nowhere for his heel to go. When I start at the wrist and I slide, he could slide down to the elbow. So I could start here, and as he's defending, then maybe the heel slides down to the lower part of my forearm. It's got room to move. But if I already start there, there's no more room, so the heel slips a little bit and he's gone. Okay? So he could slide down if necessary. Now, preferably, we want to be up high, like so, because we got that elevation of the wrist we were talking about before. Okay? So pressure on the toes, elevation of the wrist. Okay? To the best of our ability in the bicep, and catching underneath the wrist like so. All right, now let's talk about the middle portion of the leg. Okay, like I had mentioned before, my hips and pelvis look to turn and rotate the knee, just like the outside heel hook, all right, only this time in a different direction, okay? All right, as I turn my training partner's foot, the foot gets turned in this direction, okay, towards me, okay, while the knee is gonna get turned in this direction towards you guys, okay? What's very, very important, and a lot of people screw this up from an inverted heel hook situation, if we're going to get real breaking leverage, get your ass off the mat, okay? You really have to lift your butt and hips off the floor. When you lay on the mat, I'm not going to tell you you can't break somebody. You absolutely can, okay? There's just not nearly as much pressure on your training partner's knee as there could be, okay? So I'm going to push down with my legs and lift my butt off the floor. When I do this, it allows me to impart the weight of my hips and legs to my training partner's knee, okay? As opposed to just kind of a slow drive here, okay, where I can kind of lightly press my hips in. Now, with my hips up off the ground, I'm really able to turn and rotate and lay weight onto my training partner's knee. So I lift, I put pressure on the toes, and watch as I kind of come up onto the knee here with my hips up in the air, and I press my hips down and into my training partner's knee. Okay? Once again, there also has to be a connection at the end. Okay? There's got to be a connection to my training partner's hip in some way. There's a ton of different ways to do it. Something has to cross the plane of his hip. I just can't do something like this where there's no control of the hip. Watch as his hip leaves the ground, okay? And I can't control enough to break. Okay, he has to be pinned down. That's what my legs are doing. Okay, my hips have to leave the floor, and I have to rotate my upper body around the foot. Okay, I'm going to try to reposition so that you guys can see as much of the mechanics as possible. Okay. One other thing I'll mention, actually we'll talk about this, we'll talk about that in the later part of the DVD. I was going to talk about head position, but we'll get to that when we get to more advanced lessons. So that's a pretty good basic overview of inverted heel hook breaking mechanics. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the basic breaking mechanics involving a knee bar. Okay, just give me a hold of your leg. Okay, so we'll start, rotate your butt around the other direction. We'll start by throwing our legs to the inside, so it would be a cross ashigurami situation, and just elevating my training partner's leg like so. Okay, so if you don't know how I just got into that position, take your training partner's leg, put it across your body, throw your legs to the inside, and we're going to start elevating my training partner's heel. Okay, so as far as the knee bar is concerned, okay, we're working at 3 parts again. Okay, I have my pelvis against my training partner's knee, my feet are connected to my training partner's hip down at the end, okay, and my hands are placed somewhere on my training partner's leg, all right, to develop a meaningful connection so I can extend the heel back, okay? Now, let's talk about what we need to make this happen, okay? If I'm going to knee bar my training partner, I'm going to be pulling on my training partner's leg. There's one direction of force, all right, towards me, okay, or over my shoulder. And then there's another direction of force, which would be my hips applied at the level of the knee, or I'm driving into my training partner, okay? So, as far as leverage is concerned, whatever it is that we're pulling on our training partner's heel with, okay, because there's different variations. There's things like lat knee bars, etc., okay? Whatever it is that we're pulling with, whether it's the hands, whether it's the lat muscle, whatever it is, needs to be positioned at the end of the lever, okay? When we do so, midway, even a lat knee bar, if I put my shoulder low on my training partner's calf muscle, or if I put my hands low on my training partner's calf muscle, as I pull, it's incredibly inefficient. Like I mentioned, we want our levers to be as long as possible, okay? So I'm going to take my hands and glide them up towards my training partner's heel, and I'll take one hand like so and pull towards the inside of my bicep, and then support with the other hand, okay? You can technically do this either way. I could use this hand and then support with this hand, okay? As I do this, I rotate my training partner's knee into my hip, I press my hips forward, and I drive in for the finish. Like I mentioned, there's lat variations, there's all different kinds of things that we can do. All right, but these are the very bare minimum basics that we need, all right, for these knee bars to happen. Another thing to mention, okay, because I mentioned my legs are a connection at the end of my training partner's hip, my hips touch my training partner's knee, and then I have some part of my upper body attached to my training partner's foot, okay? If I'm going to be doing this, the best case scenario is one in which the leg is positioned on the top side of my body. What do I mean by that? This would be positioned on the bottom side of my body. Okay, if I were to try to knee bar somebody from here, it tends to not be particularly effective. Okay, so whatever knee barring we're doing, all right, we do it on the top side of our body. Okay, now that changes if I fell to the other side. Okay, it's still the top side of the body, but now you'll notice that the leg is on the other side. Okay, before the leg was underneath my left armpit, okay, or elevated over my left shoulder. Now it will be elevated over my right shoulder. Okay, in fact, I tend to prefer to do the knee bar on this side because I'm laying on my training partner's bottom leg. We'll discuss that later. Okay, so I grab at the end of the lever, my pelvis presses in towards my training partner's knee, my heels go back heel into my own hips or my training partner's hips. Okay. And I break like so. Again, mentioning that we can pull into lat positions, etc. And the idealized breaking position is one in which the leg is on the top side. Okay? If I put the leg on the bottom side, it's very difficult to do. Even to position myself in a position where I can even get breaking leverage is difficult. You're not going to break very many people here. Okay? So we're always finding a way to get to that top side, which means that sometimes my training partner will change positions. Perhaps he rolls or something like that, okay? And if I want the knee bar to still stick, I might be knee barring my training partner on the top side. He goes to roll. The top side becomes the bottom side. Go ahead. That means I'm probably going to have to switch. Go ahead, keep rolling. That knee bar position to the other side of my body, okay? So these are the basic mechanics of finishing a knee bar. We want a long lever. We want our hips pressed against our training partner's knee and some sort of connection with our legs at the end of the hip, wherever we may be knee barring our training partner. So I thought it would be useful for us to discuss some basic mechanics of the Achilles lock. There's a few other submissions, but this is probably the last one in the main series that I think is relevant to give you a good basic overview of. All right, so when it comes to Achilles locks, okay, one of the things that's most special about the Achilles lock is the fact that I can technically perform the lock without control of my training partner's upper hip. It's actually possible for me to do an Achilles lock with control below the knee and still finish my training partner. We'll talk about that later on in the DVD. The reason that I mention that is simply because almost all of the other submissions that we've done thus far, that can't happen, okay? If your Ashigarami in a heel hook ever slides below your opponent's knee, you're done. You got nothing, okay? When you have an Achilles lock, that's no longer true, okay? So that's one of the special features, all right, of this type of submission. So sometimes when I'm in the process of trying to submit somebody with something else, like a heel hook or whatever the case may be, and they start slipping out of it, it's a great idea to just punch into Achilles locks, whether it be on the outside like so, or on the inside like so. All right, it does a really good job controlling my training partner, and I'm still always able to threaten my training partner in some way at any given point in time, even when the Ashigarami slides down the knee. Now, what are some components that make our Achilles locks stronger? All right, the kind of general look at Achilles locks over the years has been, hey, I'm going to grab my training partner's ankle, not really particularly in any spot. I'm going to grab my own wrist in some way, okay? And probably put my feet on my training partner's hips, okay, in some way. And then I'm just going to start bridging into my training partner, okay? And you can get some results out of this, okay? It's going to hurt your training partner's calf muscle at the very least if you do things this way, okay? So once again, in the training room, especially if you're bigger and stronger than most of your opponents, you're going to get some taps. You get some false positives. And then when you go out in competition, you're going to go to crank onto somebody's leg like this in Achilles lock. And you're either A, not going to do the damage you're wishing to do, or B, they're not going to tap, okay? We got to do one or the other, or there's kind of no point to the submission hold, right? So as I get a hold of my training partner's ankle, the first thing that's relevant to discuss is increasing leverage. It's one of the things that we're always looking to do. So when I cover my training partner's foot, and I want to maximize leverage, what I want to try to avoid doing is I want to try to avoid using my shoulder at my training partner's midfoot. I'd like to position my shoulder over my opponent's toes, shoulder and bicep, I suppose you could say. If I look back over my shoulder and I can see my opponent's toes, I know that my shoulder probably isn't positioned properly. So that's the test that you can perform, okay? You look back over your shoulder. I can still see his toes. So I'm going to walk it back, cover those toes. Now I know that the lever is this long as opposed to this long. Okay? Second positioning, the fulcrum. Okay? My wrist bone. My wrist bone wants to be placed, again, hopefully, where I would hope to break my training partner. Again, rare in an Achilles lock, does happen every so often, that somebody's shin snaps in half. So if you're placing your Achilles lock halfway down someone's shin, okay, your forearm bones are halfway down someone's shin, and you're driving in, to me, looking at that type of leverage, what you're hoping to do is snap someone's shin in half. Now, if you're strong enough to do that, great. I'm not, I don't think. Okay? So I'm going to focus my efforts at tearing my training partner's ligaments in the ankle. Similar to the toe hold, but a little different. Okay, you see that there's slightly different ligaments here, all right, that are attached to my training partner's shin. Probably these, as opposed to in the toe hold, we have a set of ligaments right here around the outside of my training partner's malleoli, all right? And now with a straight Achilles, we're focused more on these ligaments here, okay? So I want my fulcrum as close to that breaking point as possible, which is going to be right about here, okay? So my forearm slides down, basically until where my training partner's heel or calcaneus stops my wrist, okay? Then I flare my elbow and shoulder over the toes, so I know I'm at the end of the lever. So now we got a lever that looks like this, as opposed to a lever that looks like this. Okay, and now I'm in good proper position. The number one thing that people mess up in Achilles locks is elevation of the hands. Okay, they get a hold of the ankle and everything starts good. People do this in guillotines also. Everything starts good. The wrists are high, position's great. You know, hope maybe they know the leverage thing that I talked about. Maybe they don't. Okay, but at the very least, the hands start high, and then whether an outside Ashigarami, a Rimi, whatever it is, they fall to their side or they fall back, and they let their hands droop. And as their hands droop because their arms fatigue, they start driving in with the pelvis, and they don't get any good relevant results here. Why? They let the fulcrum sink down. Okay? In any leverage situation, we want the fulcrum as elevated as possible. Okay? So, as I maximize my lever, one of the keys to maximizing that lever is an elevated fulcrum. I have to maintain that elevated fulcrum throughout the move. That doesn't mean I can't fall to my side. That doesn't mean I can't fall back. But what it does mean is I can't allow my arms to fall, which is the main reason why I've never liked some of the grips that people favor in this situation. Like so. Can you break somebody here? You absolutely could. But I often find that grabbing somebody that way promotes dipping your hands down. Okay? So the way I'm going to coach you in the basic part of the mechanics here is to elevate this as high as possible and just keep locked hands like so. Okay? Now, like I had mentioned, I want some sort of connection on my training partner's hip. Just like in any of my other moves, if there's no connection, as I bridge into the ankle, my training partner's hips leave the mat, and he can go with the pressure of the break. And I can't get a proper break here. So I hold and pin my opponent down with the pressure of my heels. Okay, and I hold my training partner at the hip. Okay, now my pelvis is going to help me. Okay, it's going to help me drive in. This time, not so much at the knee, more at the ankle. Okay, and as I drive in, I lift the hands and I pressure back over my training partner's toes. What helps us here, is my head position, arching over my training partner's toes. If I keep my head in tight like so, I can only go back so far. I want spinal extension. My head starts to extend back. What you don't want is your head to go far away from your hands. If I let my hands sink down and my head extend, I lost the pressure. Okay, so it's not just about the head. The head's going to come with the rest of my body. My hands elevate as the head moves back. And now we can get pressure. Okay, so once again, covering the toes, fulcrum where it should be at my training partner's ankle. I look back, I don't see the toes. We're in good shape. Okay, I establish something that's going to control my training partner's hip. Now my head starts to arch back, but my hands come with it. And I break. And there's various positions of which you could break. I personally prefer the side. Why? If I start putting my back flat to the mat, I've just placed a limit of which I can arch. I can only go so far back now. When I'm on my side, the follow through for the ankle lock is so much farther. So I tend to prefer finishing on my side or belly down for a good strong break. Okay. That concludes the basic breaking mechanics of the Achilles lock. So we went over quite a few different things involving mechanics, and those being the mechanics of the submissions that you guys are going to be using as your weapons, the vehicles for those submissions, the various forms of leg entanglements. All right, again, we're starting out very basic. And then I think another relevant topic to bring up it's a very important subject matter to me, because there's going to be a point in your careers or your training or whatever the case may be where you can have your training focused around the idea of trying to achieve submissions or moves, whatever it is. And if those moves don't work out, you're in a state of disappointment. Oh, I go for an armbar, I lose said armbar, and I'm upset with myself because I lost the armbar. I completely let go of what I had and I don't recover. And it's basically like the opponent either gets out of the armbar or leg lock or whatever it is, and you reset to neutral, or your opponent escapes the submission and they put you in a defensive situation. While this might be acceptable in the basic stages of the game, as you guys get better and better, it's going to be unacceptable. At the early stages, yeah, you might apply an armbar, and the first armbar you apply, somebody might tap, because they don't really know what they're doing to defend. But as you guys get better and better, and as you go with more and more game opponents, every submission, every move you apply, even things like sweeps, even things like guard passes, etc. Every move you apply is going to fail more often than it succeeds. Okay? If moves succeeded more times than they failed in competition, every match would be very quick. Okay? People would get to submissions almost immediately. All right? You have to understand the bulk of the movements that you're going to do are going to fail. Okay? And when it comes to leg locks, we have to have strategies to compensate for that failure. When it comes to any move, really, we want to have strategies to compensate for that failure. Ultimately, I don't even want you to look at it as failure when you mess these moves up. I don't even want you to look at it as failure when you miss the heel hook and your training partner spins out or whatever the case may be. I just want you thinking about when this move doesn't work or when this move doesn't tap my opponent, where am I going to go next that's advantageous for me? Advantageous being the key word. We're always looking for some sort of competitive advantage over the opponent. What are our competitive advantages? Okay, maybe I move to another submission. I cover that in my last DVD. Okay, unifying the system. We go from one system to the next. We're moving from submission to submission. You could even stay within the same submission subsystem. I might go from one leg lock to the next leg lock. Okay. What's another thing that we could do that would be advantageous to us? Well, we could recover that same submission that we just kind of failed. We could find a way to recover said submission. Okay. Another thing that we could do is we could assert positional dominance. Maybe I was in bottom position and now I'm in top. Maybe I was in top position and now I passed the guard. Maybe I was in any position and now my training partner's back is exposed. Okay. Now these are strategies that we could use for almost any submission subseries as an advantage to look for when we fail. Okay. But specifically for leg locks, I'm going to describe what kinds of things we're going to be looking to do as our leg locks fail. Okay. And we'll get more specific into this as we go throughout the DVD, but let's go through a basic introduction so you have a blueprint for success. Okay. First things first. Okay. The number one reason why your submission attacks will fail will be due to the space that develops between you and your opponent. Okay? You'll be going for a particular submission, whatever it is, and your opponent is going to start to slide away from you. Okay? Notice his knee is now beyond the line of my hips. Okay? I want my hip line to the bare minimum match up with my training partner's knee line. Okay? The moment that's no longer the case, and you can see the knee behind my butt or my hips, I have now lost said submission, right? All right, or I'm losing said submission at the very least, whether it be an Achilles lock, heel hook, whatever the case may be. So one of the things we can look to do is to recover. So option number one in our blueprint for success here is as we're losing whatever it is that we're losing, so he's pushing on my knees or something like that, I get a hold of my training partner's leg. Just do it with your hands for the time being instead of the feet. I grab a hold of my training partner's leg, I open up, and I climb closer to my opponent. I could do this from an Arimi Ashigarami situation, same thing. He's pushing away, and I scoot my butt closer to the opponent. Okay, and there's numerous drills that we can do for this. But the important thing is to understand what we need to do. Okay, first thing in the blueprint for success, get closer to the opponent. Okay, climbing, I often refer to it as. Okay, climbing the leg. As I lose a leg, I climb the leg. Let's look at it from a knee bar situation. Okay, my training partner is in this situation. I'm starting to knee bar my training partner. He's walking away from me. I climb closer to the opponent. Okay? Will climbing always work? Of course not. Okay? Not every submission loss is recoverable like that. Okay? At which point, we want to start thinking about switching. Okay? So, I'm attacking one leg. Okay? And I mentioned that one of the things you could do to gain an advantage over your opponent as you fail, okay, would be to jump to another submission hold. Now, you might not be in a submission hold right away. Maybe it's another form of Ashigarami. With leg locks, the Ashigarami comes. The submission follows very quick. My training partner pushes away, and I notice climbing is no longer an option. I don't have much of his leg anymore. I can't establish any control. Okay? So what can I do? Well, there's another foot pushing on my leg. I get a hold of this foot, and I switch. Maybe to an attack on the opposite leg. Okay? He goes to push out again. Same sort of story. I switch. And I'm probably going to have to switch and climb. So I'm probably going to have to get closer to him to attack. Okay? So now we have two different examples of things that we can do as we're failing leg submissions. Okay? I can either climb my opponent's leg to get closer to him so I can fix the submission. okay? Or I can switch to my opponent's other leg, okay? This is another way that we can convey advantage and stay on offense. Offensive cycles are so important. The third thing we can do is convey positional advantage, but not with Ashigarami, with body position, okay? For example, as my heel hook or whatever the case may be gets disrupted and my training partner is pushing away and my training partner's leg is sliding out, I can take my training partner's leg, elevate it in the air, and I can get to top position, okay? Now, top position can be desirable. I mean, it's jiu-jitsu. You can submit people from top and bottom. Sometimes that's going to be the result of a sweep, okay? I very well may have been working on trying to submit my opponent from a bottom position, okay? My training partner fought out of said submission. Face me. Put your heel on the ground. Okay. I sit the guy down, and instead of focusing on the submission, I get on top of the guy. Maybe I was going for some form of a heel hook. He started rolling, etc. And as he started rolling out, I decided no more submission. It's time to get on top. Okay, furthermore, you can take that another step farther and possibly immediately guard pass your training partner, depending upon what's going on here. Okay, so in our blueprint for success, we have climbing, we have switching, and then we have gaining dominant position. That could mean getting on top, okay, and passing the guard. Or sorry, it could be getting on top, or it could be getting on top and passing the guard, okay? So my training partner in this sort of situation is pulling away from me, and maybe I pull myself right into a side control situation, okay? Or right into, as my training partner pulls away, face me with your legs, an immediate circling, and a passing of my opponent's guard, okay? Again, I'm not getting too specific here with my movements. Just understanding that these opportunities are there, okay? So we got 3 parts of the blueprint, okay? We got climbing, we got switching, we have moving to dominant positions, either getting on top or passing, okay? And then as a whole other subcategory, even though it's still a dominant position, I would say as a 4th category, getting to the back, okay? There's a lot of opportunities upon failed leg attacks to get to your training partner's back. Why? Because many of the leg submissions that we're going for are rotational. And if I'm going to perform a rotational submission, you can bet that the way my training partner needs to try to escape or alleviate pressure is also going to be rotational. And that means that upon attacking an opponent who's trying to evade said attack, he will often go from a situation where he's facing me, go back, where he's facing me, to one where he's looking away. And anytime I see my opponent looking away, it's an appropriate time to start coming up and getting behind my opponent and eventually taking his back. Okay? So, while I didn't show you guys very specific movements, specific drills, you can start to piece it together all on your own. Even if you watch no more of the DVD to learn the specific sequences, you can say to yourself, okay, when I have a heel hook, what am I looking for? Oh, I want to climb my training partner's leg. If I can't climb the leg anymore, what am I looking for? Oh, I'm going to switch to the other leg. Oh, I can't switch to the other leg. Well, let me try to get on top. Oh, my opponent turned his back. Oh, let me try to get to his back. So now we have a 4-part blueprint of which we can always be looking for these 4 opportunities to capitalize on our own failures, right? Or perhaps not even our failures, but our opponent's abilities to escape or counter or whatever the case may be, okay? On our opponent's defense. Okay, maintaining dominance, maintaining submission pressure, positional pressure, whatever the case may be. Instead of, oh, I hip in for an Achilles lock, he pulls out, and then the game is off. We want to continue that assault, always having the advantage over our opponent.